Hello and welcome back to AP World History Modern. Today we're going to begin day 1 of Unit 4.3, Columbian Exchange Overview. So we're looking at interactions between human and environment. Our skill practice today is going to be claim development. All right, so we'll kind of look around how to address this topic if it comes up as an essay. And our learning objective is to explain the causes of the Columbian Exchange and its effect on the Eastern and Western Hemisphere. All right, so just kind of a broad overview. All right, so this is a map demonstrating the diversity of Amerindian world before European invasion. All right, and kind of looking at the different different groupings that you could see, and this is coming from a Latin American history book. All right, so here are our examples, our historical developments, our standards. All right, so if you look at long distance trade, right, it moves more than simply spices and silk and porcelain, right? So when you talk about increased interaction between different regions, it is an all-encompassing thing, or it needs to be an all-encompassing thing. So when we start talking about the Columbian Exchange and the interaction between the Americas and Afro-Eurasia, understand we're going to be talking about more than just goods, all right? And so that being the case, you'll often see there's all kinds of these infographics around that show you, what specific things were originated in Afro-Eurasia and which specific things originated in the Americas. So what was being introduced for the first time in one direction and what was being introduced for the first time in another direction. All right. So often a lot of the story gets focused in on a couple of primary things, and we are going to talk about these things today. All right. So things like diseases, right? So here's an illustration of smallpox. Crops and animals, right? So you'll kind of get on, the introduction to the horse. So the horse, historically there was a horse. The horse did exist in the Americas. However, they'd been extinct for about 10,000 years before the arrival of the Europeans in the Americas. So it's actually a reintroduction of the horse, all right? And so you'll hear a lot about that, and we'll talk about that today as well. As well as some of the crops, right? Some have a more significant impact than others, all right? So, and of course, sugarcane is a major part of the story. This is not only a luxury good, but it's also going to be the primary driver of demand for the Atlantic slave system. All right. So this is, and of course, this is part of the Columbian Exchange as well. So you start, when you look at this notion that that the people, right, are part of the Columbian Exchange, and the diffusion of not only crops from the African continent, but also African culture and religions, right? And we'll talk about that as well today. All right. So yes, so the African diaspora will have major cultural implications on the Americas. All right, so let's go ahead and go through some of the notes that we did in class today. I'm going to exit that screen. So in class today, we just kind of started looking at this and just kind of looked at the products, looked at the things, and I reminded students that your LEQ that we're going to have at the end of this unit. Options 1 and option 2 are specific to the Columbian Exchange, and so option 1 is looking at the how the Columbian Exchange affected in the Americas and how the Columbian Exchange affected peoples in Afro-Eurasia. So what we did in class today is we looked at this for a moment, and then we looked at this John Green video, right, the one that I have kind of right here. All right, so we went through this John Green video. And we looked at, we simply looked at what he had to say, how he covered the topic, and what categories of analysis he created for us, and then how he supported those categories of analysis. So I would highly encourage you to watch this, and kind of go along with what we're doing today in class. So we started off by watching the first little intro segment, which runs right up until the intro hits. So let me kind of get an idea of where that stops. So from 0 up until, right, couldn't leave those that long, but yes, I don't even know. There we go. So for the first about a minute or so. So we watched it for about a minute or so, and then we stopped it, right? And then at that point, I just, I asked students, what did you get out of this? What do you, what did you learn from watching that little intro segment there, all right? And so if we're looking at, explain the causes of the Columbian exchange and the effects, that first little intro part does a couple of things. One is it gives us a large, like overarching claim, that the Columbian exchange resulted in the diminished diversity of plants and animals, species in both the eastern and the western hemispheres. But that's just too broad for us to effectively use. But he does get into the idea of causes, right? So he does get into this idea of causes, right? So causes of the Columbian exchange. All right. So there are. So he talks about Columbus, right? If it hadn't been for Columbus, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then the Columbian exchange would have never occurred. Now he doesn't really go much beyond that, but we've already talked about this. We've already had homeworks on this, so you should be able to simply go through and come up with some actual categories of analysis that were the causes of the Columbian exchange. Okay. And, increasingly, I've also been seeing it referred to as the encounter. So you may see it as the encounter here, and there as well. It's not something I saw like 30 years ago when I was in college, but I have seen that terminology used lately. I think there's an attempt to abandon the Columbian in Columbian exchange. I think that's kind of where that comes from. But so it's always good to be aware of of verbiage, right, that is being used. All right, so European developments in navigation. All right, so one of the primary causes of the Columbian exchange was European developments in navigation. And what kind of evidence? Right, what kind of evidence could we use to support that? You could talk about, Henry of Portugal. Right, Henry of Portugal. I think the more common way of seeing it is Henry the Navigator, but I don't really like Henry the Navigator. Prince Henry of Portugal. Right, so that might be a better way to put Prince. Right? Prince Henry of Portugal, and of course his school, right, in Sangre. And so what are they doing there? He pulls together, technology and knowledge that enables long distance exploration to be possible. So in class we just kind of go through and do a quick little recap of this. Can you name examples of technology that was pulled together, and at the school at Sangra? The students are pretty quick to remember this. Lateen sail from the Indian Ocean, compass from China, the astrolabe from Greece that was perfected or that was improved upon by Dar al-Islam. The caravel, the boat, right? So students are pretty quick to get the tech knowledge as well, the star charts, wind currents, ocean currents, right? Those examples of knowledge that was pulled together there, right? So that's one you could do. Another one that comes up in class, European desire. You still see that? Yep. European desire for trade routes. Right, for trade routes to access spices from the Indian Ocean or Southeast Asia. Not that they knew it was Southeast Asia. So you know, Indian Ocean is probably fine, right? But this is a main reason why the Portuguese, right, create the school of navigation, trying to cut out the Ottomans from that, trying to reduce their costs, trying to get part of that. Obviously, this is the reason why Spain, right? Why did Spain commission Columbus? Why did Spain pay Columbus, an Italian, right, Genoese? Why did they give him the Nina and the Pinta and the Santa Maria? They're looking for spice, right? They're looking for routes. And of course the English, the French, right? And eventually the Dutch, right, are all going to be looking for these routes, right? Which is all going to then result in colonization, right? So the French are going to be exploring up the St. Lawrence River in the pretty early in the 1500s. You'll get permanent British settlement, by 1607 at Jamestown. Obviously, the Dutch are gonna colonize the Hudson Valley in New York. All right, but initially they are all looking for the same thing. All right, next, another possible category of analysis you could use, to kind of supplement what John Green had said there is you talk about the rise, right? The rise of the Atlantic trade system. All right, the rise of the Atlantic trade system and African diaspora. All right, so you don't have, the Columbian exchange includes, not just Europeans going to the Americas and that interaction taking place, but it also involves Africa, right? And Africans, in the African diaspora as part of that mixing. So the rise of the Atlantic slave trade in the African diaspora is going to have implications, right? So it's kind of evidence here, right? So food, right? So food will be brought, okra, rice, and the such, right? But also, and this is what we will talk about tomorrow, cultural, specifically religious, right? Religious syncretism will take place, right? As a result of that. All right, and then and then lastly, if you want to talk about the causes of the Columbian exchange, the establishment of European settler colonies. All right, the establishment of European settler colonies. All right, so some examples of evidence here. You could say Brazil. All right, Brazil being Portuguese. Obviously, the rest of Latin America. So Latin America, much of the Caribbean, so Cuba, numerous Caribbean islands, Puerto Rico, eventually Hispaniola until 1600, and then the eastern half of Hispaniola. Basically from Florida in the United States today, kind of running across the Southwest from Texas up to Oregon, and then south, right through Mexico into Central America, the northern part of South America, the entire western half, and the southern part of South America are Spanish. Right. So yeah, these are the kind of primaries, right? Because these are kind of the two primary players involved in that. So these are some basic causes. Then you can kind of get into French in Canada if you wanted to give further examples. All right. So from there, we pick back up with with our John Green film, and then we just kind of watch and go through the claims that he gives, and and you're welcome to stop this video and go ahead and watch that. And then when you're done, maybe you could try to take notes yourself off from that. I'm just going to show you what we did in class, like what we came up with. All right. So the way that we looked at this in class, let me zoom out a little bit and let me pull this all the way up. All right. So in class, we chopped a piece of paper up into 4 different parts. Right, and then we took each of these little grids and basically broke it down into the 4 different topics, right, that John Green talked about: plants, people, right, plants, people, animals, and diseases. All right, so these are the 4 different topics that he broke his down to, and then from there we kind of just watched what he said, and then looked at where it was an impact, right? Because we have to differentiate between Eastern Hemisphere and Western Hemisphere, Afro-Eurasia or the Americas. So we kind of broke this down, right? Broke the boxes down like this. Just denote what we were focusing on. All right, impact, and impact. All right. So that's what that's how we broke this down. So the first one we did is the topic of diseases, because I think that's what he did first in his video. So what is a category of analysis that he gives in his video? So he actually gives a couple. All right, he actually gives a couple of different categories of analysis. But I only really chose one, right? So we're really just kind of looking to get us started here. So one category of analysis, right? What you could turn into a thesis, all right, is this idea that the introduction, right, the introduction of new diseases, such as smallpox, right, but not limited to smallpox. And John Green actually lists off a whole bunch of other diseases. In the class, we kind of stop for a minute and just say, why is this such a one-sided exchange? Why aren't you seeing endemic diseases heading in the other direction? What's different about Afro-Eurasia than the Americas? And I like to ask this question because invariably I'll have a class or two where a student will say they don't have to develop trade routes, and that's not the case, as you're going to see in a second, or if you've already watched it, that that's not the case. Right? So it's not about trade routes, and it's also not about, the Americas not having cities. We know Tenochtitlan is estimated to have 200,000 people living in that city. Right? So what is the primary difference? The answer is right here. Right? There's not many domesticated animals in the Americas, whereas you have a long history and tradition of domestication in humans living in close proximity to domesticated animals, which means diseases are more able to make that jump, from animals to humans, right? Because of the proximity that animals live with humans, whereas it's not the case in the Americas, right? So that's largely why. So you can see there's just many, right? Many diseases that are going to go in that direction, and of course, many of them are a result of domestication of animals. All right. So there's that. All right, so we kind of stop and just kind of clarify that real quick. All right. So such as smallpox. All right. Where was I? Such as smallpox resulted in the death of Amerindian rulers, disease destabilizing them. Destabilizing their empires as Europeans arrived. Okay, so this is one of the categories of analysis that John Green provided for us, right? He does give a couple, starvation, right, etc. But I'm going to focus on this one because he actually does develop this and provide a couple of examples of evidence, right? And traditionally, I don't really spend any time in class on this because most of my students had already learned about Moctezuma and Atahualpa when they were sixth graders. However, in the state of Georgia, the curriculum changed a few years back. And this year's students are the first of my students to ever have not learned about the Aztecs and the Inca. Right? So I do, because of that, I'm going to take a moment and at least just explain this real quick. So I'm going to do it in the opposite order that John Green does it, just to be more chronological. So one is the Aztec, all right? And of course, that story begins in 1519, all right? So when you're talking about the Aztec, right, the Aztec is a good example because, just before the arrival of the Spanish into what is today Mexico, the emperor died, right? And then we see a new ruler, right? So a new ruler who is the nephew of the old one, and his name is Moctezuma II. All right, so Moctezuma II, and the quick part of the story is you have a young ruler who is ruling over an empire, right? So ruling over an empire that is a tribute state empire. All right, so not a highly centralized empire. It does have a centralized core, but it is decentralized in its administration. So you have tribute states, right? And one of these tribute states will eventually align themselves with the Spanish, and that's the Tlaxcalans. I may have spelled that wrong. So Tlax, T-L-A-X, right? Right, and of course our Spanish conquistador. Right, our Spanish conquistador is Cortez. Sometimes you see that spelled with a Z at the end, right? So this is, the short story is you've got a new ruler of a tribute state empire who has loose loyalty connections by its tribute state members. And Cortez is able to use that, kind of loose loyalty to his advantage and develop an alliance between the Tlaxcalans, which means the thousands of or tens of thousands of warriors that Moctezuma and the Mexica would have had at their disposal would have been reduced greatly, making it a more even fight, right? So that's the short version of it, all right? And of course, smallpox comes into play because you only have this, you only have this new emperor because of smallpox, right? So smallpox hits them before the Spanish even arrive, all right? So that's kind of the short version of it. There's a longer version you can kind of talk about when Cortez and his soldiers arrive in Mexico. They walk from the Caribbean coast up to the Central Valley. What they actually do participate in a number of conflicts along the way by some tribute, so some of these tribute troops within the Aztec Empire. But when they actually arrive in Tenochtitlan, they are unopposed, right? They're allowed to freely walk across the causeway, and then Cortez meets with Moctezuma, and then they actually live in Tenochtitlan for months. So it's only after 6 months that, more than 6 months, that eventually one of the conquistadors will kill a Mexica priest, and then they will be chased out, and then you see the formal alliance develop between Cortez and the Tlaxcalans, and that provides that head-to-head conflict which results in the siege of Tenochtitlan. And while the city is being sieged, smallpox runs through the population, and and famine hits as well. Right, so resulting in the collapse of the Mexica regime, and then you see the utter destruction of Tenochtitlan. So the buildings are dismantled, the city is flattened, and then a new capital will be built on top. So today most of that Lake Texcoco has been filled in. And Mexico City is literally built upon the ruins of the Aztec. All right. So you have a complete removal of a civilization, and that doesn't go without controversy in Europe, which also impacts the next piece of evidence that was provided. So in your homework tonight, your Strayer homework, he does mention the Inca, but he literally only mentions the word Atahualpa. It doesn't really give you any of that story, right? So the second evidence that is given to us by John Green is about the Inca, and of course another emperor who dies. All right, Huayna Capac, and of course he dies years, like a decade before the arrival of the Spanish. So how does he get smallpox? Right? How does he get smallpox a decade before the Spanish even arrive? The answer is trade routes, right? Trade routes, or as Strayer calls them, the American web. Right? But I've always been fancy to the turquoise road, right? The turquoise road, right? All right, but so we have the death of another emperor to smallpox. This is going to result in a civil war, right? And out of that civil war emerges Atahualpa. Right, Atahualpa, and he is only in control for a couple of months. When the Spanish conquistador named Pizarro, right, Francisco Pizarro and Hernan Cortez, when Pizarro arrives, right, and then conquers him. So that's the short story. Right. Once again, that's kind of the short version of the story. The longer version of the story is, you do see a civil war, and Atahualpa is the new emperor. However, Atahualpa still, he outnumbers Pizarro by tens of thousands. Right, tens of thousands of warriors. I've read as much 20 to 30,000 warriors at the disposal of Atahualpa versus less than 200 conquistadors with Pizarro. At any point, Atahualpa could have massacred Pizarro and his men as they're walking from the Pacific coast up the Inca Road, using the Inca Road, heading up towards Cusco. At any point they could have been massacred, but as the story goes, Atahualpa wanted something that Pizarro had. He wanted the horses, right? He could see the advantage of having horses. Thought that'd be a beneficial thing. So because he wanted the horses, and he was getting relay messages from his messengers on the Inca Road. He was getting daily updates about Pizarro and his men kind of heading towards them. These messengers never interacted with the Spanish. They were just watching them and then reporting back. And in these reports coming back, there was talk about a man who took care of the horses at night, and made sure that they were healthy. And so they wanted that man kept alive. And they also wanted the man the blacksmith, right? The man who was shoeing the horses. So they were afraid that if they massacred them, those people might die, and et cetera, et cetera. So a decision was made to allow Pizarro and his men to come into contact with the Inca. And they actually meet in what is now known as the Sacred Valley. So kind of, probably 100 miles outside of Cusco, I guess. Right, so that first meeting takes place. That first interaction takes place. And, as the story goes, the priest connected or attached to Pizarro, gave Atahualpa a Bible, the Holy Bible, the Christian Bible. It is said that Atahualpa looked through the book said that this book does not speak to me, and then threw it on the ground. And then that was used as a justification by Pizarro and his men to capture and arrest and hold hostage Atahualpa. At that point, right? And this is kind of where Incan culture comes into play. Atahualpa was viewed as a living god, right? So, and a promise was made that their living god emperor would be released if a line was drawn on the inside of a room if the room was filled with gold. So gold was gathered from all over the empire over the course of months. Atahualpa's ransom was paid, and then a decision was made to quarter Atahualpa, and kill him. So, and then the complete elimination of the Inca begins. And of course, all of that gold gets melted down because, and this is one of the lessons of the Aztecs, is critiques had been coming in, and I probably should say here, you're talking like 1532 is when that starts, right? So we're a decade plus after what happens in Mexico, right? And there was controversy back in Europe about what had happened. Is it ethically and morally a good thing to do to destroy an empire? So what happens here is Pizarro simply, and then his predecessors, they will eliminate any trace of civilization. So any gold that was, obviously, a product of highly skilled artisan work, any architecture that was, obviously, part of Cusco, all that stuff was just literally destroyed, right? So the Temple of the Sun today, taken right down to its base, and then a monastery was built on top of it. So very few actual Incan artisan work remains because of that, right? Because of that. All right, so that's what we get from that first little bit. All right, so we went over that in class, and I'm just going to speed this up a little bit for you, and so you can just kind of pause this yourself. All right, so these are some of the other ones that we did in class. I'm not going to make you sit and watch me write this anymore. All right, so for plants. All right, so plants, this is impact on the Eastern Hemisphere, right? So this is answering your LEQ option 2, right? This is addressing that. So the introduction, our category of analysis. The introduction of crops from the Americas resulted in an increase in population in Europe and I made a mistake there. Europe and Asia. Okay. So why not Africa? Let's take a second to look at that. Not Africa because of population issues. There's demographic things going on in Africa. So while Asia and Europe's population are increasing following the Columbian exchange, Africa's population will stagnate because of a depopulation event taking place there, the Atlantic slave trade. All right. So introduction of crops from the Americas resulted in an increase in population in Europe and Asia. And John Green gives you this fact here from 1650 to 1850. World population will double. And then the evidence he gives you is he focuses in on Ireland, right? And then he goes on and gives you some specific pieces of evidence. An acre and a half of potatoes can feed a family for a year. The average Irish worker eats 10 pounds of potatoes a day. Between 1754 and 1845, population in Ireland doubles, right, as a result of the introduction of the potato famine. Of the potato, and that growth will go on until the potato famine hits in the mid 1840s, right? So in the mid to late 1840s, the potato famine will hit Ireland, and then that will become a major depopulation event. And I haven't seen these numbers, so I'm going to kind of wing this a little bit. I believe the population was over 6 million in Ireland in 1645, and is going to be a little over 2 million by a decade later. Between 1 to 2 million will starve to death, and the rest will migrate, some to England, many to the United States. So a major wave of Irish immigration into the United States happens in the late 1840s and that kind of first half of the 1850s. We also will look at this later on as an example of genocide. As people were starving to death in Ireland, Ireland was, because it is a British colony at this point in history, the British colonial government was exporting grain from Ireland to England. Right, so that's not what we're talking about here. All right, so and John Green then kind of gives you some other stuff. He gives you a bunch of other examples of different foods, manicod, and from the Americas to Africa. Talk about sweet potato in China, and I'm going to just kind of leave that there as this is an example. If you look in your textbook from your homework, I think it's over the weekend's homework coming up. You will. I mean, there's a ton on China, so Strayer spends a solid amount of time looking at the demographic impact of the introduction of crops from the Americas on China. All right, the next thing he does is animals. All right. So as far as animals, the introduction of animals such as the horse to the Americas, from Europe, changed the lifestyle of Indian groups. So he actually kind of drops this kind of at the very end of the crash course. He mentions the Lakota. They will abandon agriculture in favor of nomadic lifestyle. They introduced the horse for the first time in the 1730s, and then we'll kind of develop that buffalo culture, that they become known for. And of course, that will work out, tremendously for the Lakota, at least until the late 1870s. And kind of through here, I forget if it's 76 or 77. I think it's 1876. Eventually, the Lakota, their growth, they experienced population growth from through the 1700s through the 1800s as well. But eventually, their nomadic lifestyle will come to an end at the Battle of Bighorn, Custer, right? And then they'll be forced to be put on a reservation at that point. Their nomadic lifestyle will end, forced to live off government rations, etc. All right. So that's kind of a quick. They also put the Comanche in there because that's another example of an Amerindian group that adopted horse culture. All right, and we will talk about them later in the course as well. All right. The last one is peoples, and he doesn't really give you much. He kind of runs out of time. I think he sticks to his time pretty good. So I think he ran out of time on this one. So I just kind of threw one in here as something that we're going to look at tomorrow, right? So one category of analysis you could use for peoples is the Atlantic trading system included a mixing of African, European, and American cultures and peoples, resulting in all parties contributing to cultural synthesis. And some examples of evidence you could use here would be the Virgin of Guadalupe, all right, Virgin of Guadalupe, Vundun, Santiara, Condomble are all things that arise in the Americas, right? So impact in the Americas. So that's kind of one angle you could use with this, right? You could also look at just talking about people, the demographic impact in Africa, as a result of the Atlantic slave trade, right? And kind of looking at through that lens. All right, so that is where we left off today. All right, and so let me go ahead and wrap this up. All right, so and I will keep this up. I'll probably go over this debriefing summary multiple times. All right, so Afro-Eurasian had been interconnected for thousands of years before 1492. The Americans had largely, few exceptions, been isolated from Afro-Eurasia trade network. The American web, the Turquoise Road, had connected the Americas via trade, so from before 1492. And then I'll go over the rest of these in the next video. All right, so that is all for today. And we'll leave it at that. Sapriati.